Hey guys, this is Rebecca Pierce. I am here today to tell you all about how to can tomatoes at home. So if you look over here, we have a ton of tomatoes that are ready to grow from our garden this year. You can really can any kind of tomato, but we find that the ones that work the best are your really large ones. So we're thinking like beefsteaks. We actually tried a type of tomato this year called the mortgage lifter. This is an example. This is kind of a deformed one, but there's a lot of different types of tomatoes that you can with really good success. Ideally, you're going to want to look for one that's really beefy. It's got a lot of meat to it. It doesn't really matter about the seed content, although your smaller tomatoes like the Romas don't have a lot of water, don't have a lot of seeds, so you're going to want to save those for something like a sauce. So anything else you can with quite a bit of success. So today we're going to walk you through the steps as to how to do that. So if you come over here, we're going to start by blanching our tomatoes. So basically what we do is just drop them in a bucket of hot water. You want to get the water really nice, hot, and boiling. It's going to take a couple minutes for it to get back up to temperature here because we've been going through this all day. But once you get it up to temperature, what we're looking for with the tomatoes is for the skin to peel away from the body of the tomato. That way it's really easy for us to peel it and drop it into a nice hot jar. Come on over here. We have some tomatoes that are already blanched. And so what we're going to do with these, you can see the skin peels right off. Nice and easy like that. Now if you have a tomato that's not quite ripe, you're going to have some more trouble peeling it. So I'll show you an example. So this one wasn't great. It got a little bit of sun scald on the top. So we're probably going to have more problems trying to peel it. The fruit's going to stick a little bit more to the skin, and that's not a big deal. You can still can it just fine, but you want to make sure you get all the skin off. And then you're also going to need to get the core out because that will really contaminate your canning process. So once you get the skin off here, essentially all you want to do is just carefully, without cutting your fingers, you can remove the core. We are very lucky here because we have pigs, so we feed them all of our tomato scraps. Otherwise, you can just throw those out or compost them. So then once you have your tomato that doesn't have the skin on it, you're going to slowly put it into your jar. It's important to mention too that your jars need to be sterilized and they need to be nice and hot before you go to fill the jars. So if you look over here, we have our dishwasher going. It's filled with jars. They're nice and hot and ready to go. If you don't have a dishwasher, that's fine. You can just sterilize and heat your jars the old-fashioned way. But we like to use our dishwasher because then we know that we have all of our jars ready to go, and you can fit quite a few, so you don't have to worry about waiting for your jars to heat up. So once you get all of your tomatoes peeled, you're just going to stuff them into the jar. I won't show you the entire process of peeling them here because it'll take quite some time. But what you want to do is peel all of your tomatoes and core them and then fill your jar. You only want about 1 inch of headspace. So an easy way to figure out how much headspace you need is just to look at the jar. So usually this is going to be about as much headspace as you want. So if you get to this lip here, you're not going to want to fill past that because otherwise your jars aren't going to seal effectively. Okay. So once you get your jar filled, so again, I'm not going to walk you through this because it'll take a while, but once you fill your jar, you're going to want to add a teaspoon each of salt and of sugar. Now there's a lot of different recipes out there. I like the salt and sugar one because it makes sure that your tomato recipe is balanced so you don't have to worry about the safety while you're canning. Tomatoes are one of those foods that are really interesting. Most vegetables are low acidity foods, which means that you have to process them in a pressure canner. Now tomatoes, as you know, are fruits. So you can usually get away with processing them in a water bath canner, which is what we're doing today. However, tomatoes are really right on the line of being not quite acidic, but acidic enough. And so that's why we add the salt and sugar. Plus it helps with the preservation. It makes it taste a little bit better too. So we always make sure to do that. All right, so once you have your tomatoes blanching, your next step is going to be to peel them and to core them. I mentioned this before, but it's important that you only use ripe tomatoes when you're blanching them. It's not a huge deal if you use some that have like some spots of where they're not totally ripe. Like this one, you can see there's a little spot, and it's not a big deal, but you can see it's kind of hard to pull the skin off. So you'll want to pay attention to that when you're selecting the tomatoes that you're going to use for canning. But as you all know, sometimes you don't get total control over the tomatoes that you're able to use for canning. You just have to use the ones that are ready to go at the time that you are doing your canning. So the next step, once we get everything all blanched and peeled, you're going to cut the core out. Be really careful not to cut yourself. It's very easy at this point. But you also want to make sure you use a nice sharp knife so you get that whole thing out. If you don't, it can really contaminate your canning process. So I'm going to pull this section off because it had a little bit of under-ripeness. So then you're going to take your tomato and you're going to stuff it inside the jar. And as you can see, we usually like to do quarts when we're canning tomatoes, but it's pretty late in our canning season here, so we're all out of quart jars. So we're going to use pints today, which also works fine. And depending on your household's needs, a pint jar might work better, a quart jar might work better. So it's really up to you. Generally, if you're canning in a water bath, you're going to fit about just as many pints as you are quarts because of how the bases fit in the bottom. So it's not really a space consideration when you're trying to figure out whether you want to do pints or quarts. It's, for us, just a matter of what kinds of jars we had on hand. Make sure too, when you're canning, you only want to use jars that are designed specifically for canning. So don't be reusing like old mayonnaise jars or stuff like that, because it's really not going to can the way it's supposed to. And then you're going to have to worry about issues with food contamination, botulism, stuff like that. So only use like ball jars. Kerr is another good brand. Only use jars like that because otherwise you're going to have to worry about them not sealing properly, and that's really something you don't want to play around with. So I think if we get about one more tomato, we're going to have a full jar here. And it, as you can see, it really doesn't take much. I think I maybe had 3 or 4 tomatoes in this jar, and it's going to be full. All right. Actually, probably not even quite 4 because we're already full here with half of it. So once you get it in there, make sure you press it down and get all of the air gaps out of it. If you have any air bubbles in your tomatoes, you're going to have some issues with it sealing and storing properly. So make sure everything's pressed down. You can use your fingers. They also make special tools that you can use to do this. It's really up to you. Once you get your tomatoes in the jar, something that's really important, you don't want to fill your jar all the way up to this top lip here. You want to leave about 1 inch of headspace. The amount of headspace that you leave in a jar is going to vary depending on the type of food that you're canning. Tomatoes, you want to leave about 1 inch. So any recipe that you see that leaves 1 inch of headspace, that's roughly the amount where this lip starts. So usually if you leave about this much headspace, you're going to be good to go. So once you get your tomatoes in, you're going to want to wipe off this edge here. If you leave any food particles on the outside of your jar, you're going to have to worry about contamination, so make sure you wipe that down. The next thing you want to do is you want to add some salt and you want to add some sugar to your tomatoes. So tomatoes are really interesting because obviously they're a fruit, right? We know they're not a vegetable. And while they are acidic enough to be canned in a water bath canner, you do have to be a little bit careful because there is a little bit of gray area there. So adding salt and sugar helps balance out the tomatoes well enough that you don't have to worry too much about the acidity. Now, if you want to can tomatoes in a pressure canner, you can. It's not quite as efficient because you're going to have to process them for almost just as long, and so it doesn't really make a ton of sense unless you have a ton of tomatoes that you want to do all at once, because a pressure canner can hold more jars of tomatoes because you can double stack them. Otherwise, doing tomatoes just like this in a water bath canner is totally fine. Now, if you're canning something like spaghetti sauce or salsa that has peppers or onions or some other type of vegetable in it, you do want to do it in a pressure canner because those vegetables lower the acidity of your mixture here, and so they're not quite as safe to be canned in a water bath. So when we do our tomatoes, we're going to add a teaspoon of sugar and a teaspoon of pickling salt. or canning salt. Okay, don't have to mix it, that's all you need to do. The next thing we're gonna do is come over to the stove here. So if you look online, there's a lot of mixed reviews about whether you actually need to sanitize and boil your canning lids before you use them. The consensus that we've settled on is it doesn't hurt anything. If you sanitize your lids, you don't have to worry about any problems related to canning safety. You're good to go. They're nice and hot. They're all set for your canning jars. Some people say that you don't need to sanitize them, and really that's just a time-saving thing, so it's up to you. If you want to be better safe than sorry, just heat them up a little bit, make sure they're warm and ready to go. Otherwise, just get started immediately. The more important thing for you to keep in mind is that you cannot reuse the lids when you are canning. So between seasons, you can't reuse these things on your jars. Now what you can do, so obviously your jars can be reused, and you can also reuse your bands because these can be sanitized. These don't do the job of holding the seal. If you try to reuse your lids between canning seasons, a problem that a lot of people have, and actually if you talk to like your grandparents, they might say, well, I reused the lids and I was totally fine, I never got sick. And that's probably true 9 times out of 10, because 9 times out of 10 you're going to be fine. But there is that risk that if you reuse a lid, it's not going to seal and you are not going to know about it. And a lot of the bacteria that live in these cans, if they've been improperly sealed, they don't show any signs of contamination. So you might be making yourself sick and not even know until the moment when you are very, very sick. So it's really important that you can reuse the jars, you can reuse the bands, but do not reuse the lids. They're only a couple dollars. Just get new ones every season and it'll totally be worth it. Okay, so once we have our lids sanitized and ready to go, we're gonna take them out of the water. Okay, and so this lid here that I selected is a wide mouth lid. So I'm not gonna be able to use it for the regular mouth here, but that's all right. I have a wide mouth here ready to go. I just need to add some sugar and some salt. Okay. So once you have your jar ready to go, you're going to put the lid on. You are going to put your band on, and I mentioned this before, but we always sanitize our bands and we sanitize our jars in the dishwasher before we start. That way they're nice and hot and ready to go. Make sure you screw this on tight. You don't want to over tighten it on here because that can also cause issues with sanitation. But once you get it on, just squeeze it so that it's nice and secure and you're ready to go. Now we already have a batch of tomatoes going here already, so I'll take the lid off here and show you what we have going on. So as you can see, we have quite a few jars. I believe we have 7 jars of tomatoes going in our water bath right now. When you water bath can tomatoes, you're going to want to do 40 minutes for pints and 45 minutes for quarts. Make sure you don't start timing. Make sure you don't start timing. So we haven't started timing these yet because the water's not boiling. So you're going to want to start your timer when it starts boiling. So we've had these in here for a few minutes, but we haven't started our timer yet. As you can see on the stove, we haven't started it yet because we don't have boiling water. So once you get the water to boil, you can start your timer.